A few days ago, I was grabbing coffee with an old friend who works in European policy. He was practically radiating a sense of moral victory. He leaned in, his voice hushed but excited, and told me that Brussels had finally found the perfect way to fund Ukraine, using frozen Russian assets as collateral for a massive 90 billion euro loan. It's genius, he said. We're using their own money against them without technically stealing it. He genuinely believed the EU had outsmarted the system, painting it as a clean, painless win for Western values. The air in the room felt light, filled with that specific kind of self-congratulatory energy you only find in high-level bureaucracy. But then I asked him to imagine a scenario. I asked, if you found out your bank had used your personal savings as a guarantee for a loan to a bankrupt startup without your permission, simply because they didn't like your politics, would you still call it a masterstroke? The transformation was instantaneous. The excitement drained from his face, replaced by a defensive, almost panicked look. He started throwing around terms like extraordinary measures and geopolitical necessity, but the confidence was gone. He knew, just as the lawyers in Brussels secretly know, that once you break the fundamental rule of property rights, the entire structure begins to buckle. That moment of realization, the split second where justice reveals itself as simple, desperate theft, is the exact point where the EU's reality begins to crumble. Behind the polished headlines of financial strategy lies a frantic attempt to ignore a looming disaster, a world where the euro is no longer a safe haven, but a liability. And as it turns out, Russia isn't just sitting back. They've hired the most expensive legal minds on the planet to ensure that this genius move becomes the most expensive mistake in European history. We're watching the monolith of lies unravel in real time.
Wow. That's a powerful analogy. And it really gets to the heart of the tension, doesn't it? It strips away all the jargon.
It makes it personal.
It makes it visceral. And I think for our deep dive today, we have to really move past that rhetoric, whether it's the self-congratulatory stuff from Brussels or the really dramatic language of theft. We need to look at the cold, hard mechanics of what's happening.
Absolutely. We're not just talking about a clever financial trick here.
No, not at all. We're talking about the foundational trust in a global currency. And more than that, the legal stability of an entire continent. The material you've brought to the table today shows this isn't one isolated problem. It's like a triple threat that Europe is facing all at once.
That's exactly the core tension we need to unpack. You have this incredibly high-stakes legal gamble, but it's happening against a backdrop of, frankly, self-inflicted economic wounds.
Right.
So I think we need to look at this unraveling from three different angles. First, there's the existential legal and financial risk the EU is taking with these frozen assets. I mean, the precedent it sets could undermine faith in the whole Eurozone.
And that financial risk is only being taken because of the second huge pressure point, this structural economic damage. We absolutely have to get into the deindustrialization that's happening, this Greenflation paradox the sources talk about.
And how that's eroding the middle class.
Yes. And then the third angle, which is the direct result of the first two.
Capital flight.
Capital flight.
Yeah.
You can measure it. You can see European manufacturing being pulled away, lured by strategic policies from rivals and even from allies.
Especially the US and China. So let's start with that financial tightrope walk. The one Brussels is performing right this minute because that's where the drama and I think the most profound legal questions really are.
Agreed.
Okay, so let's break down the core mechanism. The EU has its hands on about, 210 billion in frozen Russian central bank assets?
Right. Immobilized assets. That's the key term.
And they've come up with what they're calling the 90 billion solution to fund Ukraine for 2026 and 2027. The structure itself is work. It's fascinating because it's trying so hard not to be outright confiscation.
It's a legal workaround. A very clever, very risky one. They're not touching the principal amount.
Right. They're only using the interest income, the profits, any cash balances that those frozen assets generate over time.
And using that stream of income as collateral.
To back a massive 90 billion loan for Ukraine.
And that's where you see the legal gymnastics. It lets them stand up and say, look, we haven't violated the principle of sovereign immunity, which is, a bedrock of international law protecting central bank assets.
They can say they're only using the profits, not the assets themselves.
Exactly. But to get a loan of that size, 90 billion, they needed a way to guarantee it. And that meant, it meant an institutional bypass that is completely new and, to be honest, really quite dangerous.
Let's talk about that bypass. Normally, for the EU to issue joint debt on this scale, you need every single one of the 27 member states to agree. Unanimity.
It's written into the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, the TFEU. It's a foundational rule.
But they didn't get it, so they used something else, a provision called Article 122 of that same treaty. And this is the real legal novelty here, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Article 122 is basically an emergency clause. It's for measures appropriate to the economic situation, in particular if severe difficulties arise.
So what was it used for before?
Much less controversial things. I mean, setting up temporary financial aid for a member state in a small crisis, or coordinating the purchase of medical supplies during the pandemic. It's an emergency button.
So using it now to bypass unanimity and issue joint debt to fund a war outside the EU, that's a huge escalation.
The huge escalation of institutional power, yes. It lets them sidestep the very loud political objections from countries like Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. They were dead set against this.
So on one hand, you could argue it shows the EU is capable of strong collective action. But on the other, it really tests their credibility, doesn't it?
It fundamentally does. When you sidestep your own foundational laws for political expediency, you send a signal. And the signal is that the rules can be bent when the stakes get high.
And that creates a massive legal precedent, a very high-risk one.
Of course. Because if you can circumvent the rules for this crisis, what's stopping you from doing it for the next one? Another financial meltdown, or maybe an even more aggressive climate response. Global investors who prize the EU for its stability and rule of law, they're now forced to price in this new institutional risk.
They're asking what financial rule gets bent next.
Exactly.
And the immediate financial risk, the focal point for all this pressure, it seems to land squarely on one institution, EuroClear.
Yes, the Belgian-based clearinghouse. They're at the absolute center of this storm.
Because they hold the lion's share of the assets, right? Something like 185 billion of the total.
That's right. They are the custodian, and that makes them the central point of failure if this goes wrong.
And the rating agencies are already getting nervous.
They've noticed, yes. Fitch put EuroClear Bank's long-term ratings on what they call a rating watch negative.
Which isn't a downgrade, but it's a serious warning flag.
It's a very serious warning. It means the bank's future financial health is officially under scrutiny because of a political decision.
So can you break down the specific risk that has Fitch so worried? What are they seeing?
It all comes down to a technical but absolutely critical concept called maturity mismatches.
Okay.
See, the Russian assets EuroClear is holding, they're not just cash sitting in a vault. They're complex long-term securities. Now, EuroClear is using the profits from these frozen long-term assets to back the loan. The danger comes if the legal situation changes, and changes fast.
Like if an international court suddenly rules against the EU?
Precisely. And you have to remember, Russia's not just sitting back. They are fighting this. They've already filed a massive $230 billion lawsuit against EuroClear.
$230 billion.
Yes. They argue the whole freeze violates sovereign immunity. So if Russia wins, or even if there's a political settlement and the freeze is lifted unexpectedly, EuroClear could be on the hook to pay back the principal and all the accrued liabilities immediately.
And these are liabilities to the Russian central bank that suddenly become payable right now.
Right now. And EuroClear, as big as it is, might not have the ready cash to cover a sudden demand of that magnitude. Their assets are tied up in these longer-term instruments.
So their liabilities could come due, but their assets aren't liquid enough to pay them off. That sounds like a classic bank run scenario.
It creates a massive balance sheet problem, a solvency risk, or at the very least a huge liquidity crisis that could ripple through the entire European financial system.
And this whole legal mess leaves Belgium, the country where EuroClear is based, in a really terrible position.
An impossible position. The Belgian government is terrified it could be held financially liable for everything if a court sides with Russia. And that's because EuroClear operates under Belgian law.
Is the rest of the EU not backing them up?
The EU has offered assurances, but they're often vague, conditional. There isn't an ironclad EU-wide guarantee. So Belgium is left holding the bag for a potential $230 billion claim. That's a risk far too big for one member state to carry for a collective EU action.
And that right there is the hidden cost of playing these unconventional games. The risk gets concentrated in one place.
And even if the courts don't rule against them right away, just the uncertainty that's already seeping into the sovereign debt markets. And that's the ultimate test of confidence.
We can actually see that, can't we, in the bond yields. The rating agencies have tried to downplay it, saying the loan is technically separate from EU budgets.
They're trying to firewall it, but the market isn't entirely buying it. The broader reaction tells a story about investor confidence in the whole Eurozone.
The data we have shows French 30-year bond yields surged to 4.50% in late 2025.
And Italy's went even higher.
Italian 30-year yields hit 4.68%. And that's often seen as the canary in the coal mine for Eurozone stress.
Exactly. Now, analysts will say, oh, that's just about their own domestic fiscal problems, high debt, and so on. But these moves are about more than that. They signal a deep, persistent unease across the entire currency area.
It's the price of uncertainty. The market isn't just pricing Italian risk or French risk, it's pricing the risk of the whole European project.
When you start bending your own rules on unanimity, when you get this close to violating sovereign immunity, global capital starts to demand a higher premium to hold your currency.
The loan might look clever on paper, interest-free, contingent on reparations from Russia that may never come.
It insulates the budgets from immediate pain.
But the long-term cost is reputational and potentially catastrophic.
The real long-term danger isn't that this specific Euro billion loan defaults, it's the precedent. If the EU tries to do this again or invents some other unconventional debt instrument for the next crisis, investor confidence could be permanently damaged.
And if the war drags on, they might be forced to.
They might.
Yeah.
And that's when you could see EU borrowing costs really start to climb. When the euro is no longer seen as that safe, predictable haven, global money goes somewhere else.
Which brings us right back to the beginning. Once property rights become conditional, capital gets nervous. So that's the first pillar of the crisis. But to really understand why they're taking such a huge risk, we have to look at the economic pressures pushing them.
Which brings us to the second pillar, the deep structural economic problems that were there long before this asset freeze, but have been put on steroids by recent policy. The context here is what our source material calls the Greenflation paradox.
It's a fantastic term. Let's define that. The basic idea is that policies designed to make things better in the future, in this case, fighting climate change with the Green Deal, are actively making things worse right now.
And not just a little worse. We're talking about a tangible, measurable reduction in present-day wealth and well-being.
It's creating a real risk of social impoverishment, a shrinking middle class, and growing poverty across Europe.
And what's really striking is that for many people, this deindustrialization is happening almost silently, generally unnoticed, as one of the sources puts it.
It's worse than that. Some ideological circles in the EU are actually celebrating it. They see losing heavy industry as a win for the Green Deal because it lowers the continent's carbon footprint on paper.
It's an incredible example of prioritizing one metric carbon reduction above everything else. Above the industrial capacity and economic stability, you need to actually pay for the European social model.
So how is this happening? What's the structural burden?
Well, the Green Deal transition is incredibly expensive, and it's being financed through a mix of green taxes, huge government spending, and just exponential debt. Think of the next generation EU funds.
And the critique is that this is basically just blowing up a financial bubble, right?
That's the argument. You're forcing huge amounts of investment into green projects, sometimes without any regard for whether they're actually productive or profitable, all based on the hope that future tech will pay off today's debt.
And the immediate result is monetary inflation, but also something the analysts call social deflation.
Social deflation. It means that even if the GDP numbers look okay, the actual living standard and purchasing power of the average person is falling.
Because the costs of the transition, new heating systems, better insulation, and especially higher energy bills, are falling disproportionately on the middle and working classes.
It eats away at their disposable income and their sense of security.
To really get at why this is a structural crisis, the source material brings up the Austrian School of Economics.
Right. Hayek, Mises. The fundamental argument of the Austrian school is that the free market is the most efficient way to allocate resources. And it's efficient because prices, the constant rise and fall of costs, act as signals. They carry this dispersed knowledge from millions of people, allowing for organic, flexible adaptation.
And the Green Deal just ignores that completely.
From an Austrian viewpoint, the Green Deal is the textbook definition of inefficient central planning. It distorts those natural price signals with a web of subsidies and taxes. It tells companies how to produce and which specific technologies they have to use.
So instead of letting the market find the best solution, planners in Brussels are picking winners.
And loading them up with bureaucratic requirements that are sometimes almost impossible to comply with.
Now, the counter-argument from Green Deal proponents would be that the market has failed. that the market prices the cost of carbon at zero, and without massive state intervention, we'd never deal with the catastrophe of climate change.
And that's the core debate, of course. The Austrian critique isn't necessarily against managing risk, it's against the method. Hayek's whole point was that central planners, because they lack that dispersed knowledge, will always lead to huge misallocations of capital. Malinvestment, he called it.
You end up subsidizing projects that can't survive without government life support.
Exactly. You create artificial bubbles and you can actually stifle the kind of genuine market-driven innovation that might be more efficient in the long run.
So in trying to regulate away future environmental uncertainty, they're creating massive present-day market uncertainty for businesses.
And the social fallout from that is immediate. This deindustrialization process is a direct threat to the middle class, which the sources call the financial and political backbone of European stability.
When you lose those high-skill, high-value manufacturing jobs in chemicals and metals and engineering, the whole social safety net starts to fray. The tax base shrinks.
And we know that manufacturing has a huge multiplier effect.
Yeah.
Every stable manufacturing job creates, one or two other jobs in services, logistics, and the supply chain. When the core job vanishes, the damage ripples outward.
And that has political consequences.
Severe ones. If the whole European project rests on the economic security of the middle class, and you keep squeezing that class with higher costs and fewer jobs, you're inviting social unrest.
Yeah.
You're creating an opening for political parties with anti-European or extremist agendas. We've seen it happen over and over again in regions that have been deindustrialized.
The whole philosophy seems to be shifting away from economic growth as the main goal.
Which makes the continent less and less competitive for the kind of large-scale manufacturing that requires cheap, reliable inputs and the global market.
Yeah.
It doesn't wait for Europe to figure things out. Capital just moves. It goes where costs are low and stability is high.
Which brings us right to the most immediate cause of that capital flight, the energy shock.
The Greenflation policies created this really vulnerable economic structure, and then the energy shock just blew it wide open. And the data here. It's not just bad, it shows a cost gap between Europe and its competitors.
Yeah.
That is just, it's a chasm.
The numbers are brutal. They tell the entire story. From late 2019 to early 2023, electricity prices in Europe jumped 300%.
300%. And gas prices. They peaked at an absolutely insane €316 per megawatt hour in August 2022. If you're running any kind of energy-intensive industry, that number just makes your business model completely unworkable overnight.
And if you compare it globally, the disadvantage isn't just a few percentage points, it's a structural barrier.
Yeah.
Let's take Germany, Europe's industrial engine. Electricity there was about $0.44 per kilowatt hour.
While the global average was about 44 cents per kilowatt hour. But the real killer for heavy industry was the gas price gap.
That's the one. Gas in Germany was $0.21 per kilowatt hour. In the United States, it was 5 cents.
5 cents.
Just think about that, a 16-cent difference per kilowatt hour. For a chemical plant or fertilizer factory that uses gas for both heat and as a raw material, that difference isn't just their profit margin, it's their entire revenue. It forces them to either shut down or move.
And the vulnerability wasn't the same everywhere. The sources show Poland, Bulgaria, Finland, and Germany were the most sensitive to losing Russian gas. And it wasn't just the cutoff. It was a perfect storm. You had droughts in southern Europe hitting hydropower, and then France had to take a huge chunk of its nuclear fleet offline for maintenance at the worst possible time.
This created a domino effect, just devastation in those energy-intensive sectors that are the backbone of the whole economy. They use, 87% of all industrial gas?
87%. And they were the first to go.
Let's talk specifics, because these stories really stick with you. The fertilizer and chemicals industry. 70% of Europe's fertilizer production was either stopped or slowed way down.
You had giants like Yara in Norway and SKW Piesteritz in Germany slashing production because the cost of gas made it impossible to turn a profit.
And this is where the policy just becomes a complete paradox. To make up for the fertilizer they were no longer producing, the EU increased its imports of Russian fertilizer 5-fold.
It's a strategic own goal of staggering proportions. You cripple your own industry with high energy costs, and then you have to buy the product from the very adversary whose actions contributed to the crisis. It's absurd.
The metal sector was just as bad. 50% of aluminum and zinc production capacity, gone.
And again, these aren't just numbers. It's real companies, real jobs. The Dutch aluminum maker Aldel went bankrupt. Slovalco in Slovakia, after almost 70 years, just stopped making aluminum. They had to lay off most of their workforce.
This is the kind of industrial capacity that takes decades and billions to build, and it can vanish in a year. And the wider economy felt it. Bankruptcies just soared.
The data is really alarming. Across the EU, bankruptcies were up 8.4% in the second quarter of 2023. That's the highest level since 2015.
And it was hitting small and medium businesses especially hard in places like France.
And then you get these really gut-wrenching stories. Companies that have been around for centuries just gone. Eisenwerk Erla in Germany, a 600-year-old company making high-end auto parts, filed for bankruptcy, all because of energy and material costs.
When a 600-year-old company can't make it work, it's not just a business cycle. It tells you something is fundamentally broken in the economic foundation.
That's right. It's the combination of the energy shock and all the regulatory burdens, the CO2 prices, the complex rules. It's a death by 1,000 cuts.
And so, inevitably, this leads to an exodus, a planned flight of capital. German manufacturers are now openly saying the US and China are better places to do business.
It's not just talk. The surveys show that nearly a quarter of German companies are either planning to move production abroad or have already started. In Bavaria, the industrial heartland, 45% of firms are investing abroad, while over half have no domestic investment plans at all.
They're giving up on their home market.
The American Chamber of Commerce in Germany backs this up. Only a third of American companies there still think it's a good place to do business. And the reasons are always the same. Unpredictable energy supply and prices that are just too high.
This is just throwing gasoline on a fire that was already burning. European firms were already growing 40% slower than American ones before the crisis.
And spending 40% less on R&D. The energy crisis just turned a long-term competitiveness problem into an acute, immediate crisis.
And this flight isn't just happening on its own, it's being actively encouraged by Europe's allies. Which brings us to the third part of our deep dive.
The external strategic pressures. And you can't talk about that without talking about the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA.
Right. This isn't just about the U.S. having cheap shale gas anymore. This is a deliberate strategic industrial policy. It's designed to reindustrialize America, partly at Europe's expense.
The IRA is an absolute game changer. It's a massive magnet for investment because the incentives are huge and they're incredibly easy to access. It's a giant pull factor.
Okay, what are the specific incentives that are so attractive?
There are two big ones. First, you get the investment tax credit.
Yeah.
That covers 30%, a full 30% of the cost of building a new clean energy factory.
30% off the top.
Right. And the second, there's the production tax credit. This is a direct subsidy. You get paid 26 dollars for every megawatt hour of clean energy you produce. So if you're a company fleeing those $1.44 per kilowatt hour prices in Germany, getting a check for 26 cents per MWH in the US is, it's a no-brainer.
But there are strings attached, right? The IRA is designed to force companies to bring their supply chains with them.
Absolutely. It has very strict domestic content rules. All the iron and steel for a project has to be made in the U.S., and at least 40% of all the components have to be sourced and made in North America. And that number is set to rise to 55% by 2026.
So if you're a European company, you can't just build one factory in the U.S. to get the subsidies. You have to convince your entire network of suppliers to move with you.
You have to onshore the whole ecosystem. And it's working. We're seeing the consequences in real time.
Tesla put its big battery plant plans in Germany on hold, specifically citing the IRA.
The chemical giant OCI is pouring investment into Texas instead of Europe. Even Northvolt, which is supposed to be Europe's battery champion, is expanding in the U.S. market.
So Europe is being strategically undercut by its closest ally, which is running a beggar-thy-neighbor industrial policy.
Exactly. But even if the IRA didn't exist, Europe faces another equally severe strategic problem that just guts the whole foundation of the Green Deal.
And that's the dependency on critical raw materials, CRMs.
This is the Achilles heel of the entire strategy. The whole green transition, all the EVs, all the wind turbines, it requires a massive, unprecedented amount of these rare minerals.
And the demand is just exploding.
The numbers are mind-boggling. Global demand for CRMs is set to increase 5-fold by 2050. For things like lithium and cobalt, it could be 10 or 20 times higher just because of the push to EVs.
Yeah.
The sheer volume is staggering, and the supply chain for it is incredibly fragile and centralized.
Centralized in one country, China.
Correct. China has methodically built a near monopoly on the processing side. They process over 90% of the world's rare earth elements. Their control over certain materials, like gallium, which is a byproduct of making aluminum, an industry that's dying in Europe, is a direct national security threat to the EU.
And the money needed to build a non-Chinese supply chain is just, it's not there.
The investment gap is huge. To meet demand by 2035, you'd need about $100 billion of investment. Right now, only about $5 billion is actually planned or approved in Europe. And since a new mine takes 10 to 15 years to get up and running,
The 2030 targets are impossible.
they're basically a fantasy. They're facing a guaranteed massive supply shortage of the very materials their entire industrial strategy depends on.
So the EU's answer to this was the Critical Raw Materials Act, the CRMA. What was that supposed to do?
The CRMA was supposed to fix this. It set targets, get 10% of raw materials from domestic extraction, and do 40% of the processing inside the EU by 2030. It's also supposed to speed up the permitting process for new mines and refineries.
But the sources we're looking at suggest it's got huge, maybe fatal flaws.
It does. It highlights this core conflict between Europe's ideology and physical reality. First, there's no real money behind it. The CRMA talks about cutting red tape, but it doesn't allocate the billions of euros needed to actually fund these risky, expensive projects.
And second, this is where the policy really starts to eat itself. The EU's own environmental rules make mining almost impossible.
That's the crux of it. The regulations for environmentally friendly projects are completely at odds with the reality of mineral extraction. Processing ore requires polluting chemicals, huge amounts of acid. To do that while meeting Europe's incredibly high environmental standards is prohibitively expensive and slow.
And you face massive local opposition, the whole not in my backyard problem.
Exactly. So Europe's society seems unwilling to accept the environmental trade-offs required to get these materials domestically, which makes the targets almost unreachable.
So if you can't get them at home, you're forced into this frantic geopolitical scramble for resources in really unstable parts of the world.
That's what's happening. The competition is heating up in Latin America and Africa. And the source material points out the extreme instability there. 7 revolutions in Africa in the last 2 years alone. Trying to secure a 30-year supply contract in that environment is risky.
The EU and the US have formed a transatlantic raw material partnership to try and counter China's dominance.
But the reality is that China controls the entire value chain. They do the mining, they do 87% of the difficult chemical separation, and they make 91% of the final high-powered magnets that go into EVs and wind turbines. The EU is barely a blip on the radar.
So Europe is structurally dependent on China for the engine of its green transition, while at the same time, its own policies are driving away the very industries that would use those materials.
It's a compounding strategic vulnerability. The deep irony is that Europe's high labor costs reflect a high standard of living. But to support high wages, you need high value add. By losing control of your core inputs, energy, and raw materials, you systematically destroy your ability to sustain that high-value economy. You're exporting your wealth and your future.
Okay, let's pull this all together. Let's synthesize these 3 crises for everyone listening.
What we've seen is Europe facing this existential triple threat. First, you have the legal and financial gamble with the Russian assets. It's an unprecedented move that undermines the principle of property rights and shakes confidence in the euro itself.
Second, you have the internal economic crisis. This greenflation paradox, accelerated by the energy shock, is actively deindustrializing the continent, hollowing out the middle class and creating deep social and political instability.
And finally, that leads to the third crisis, a profound strategic vulnerability. By betting everything on a green transition without having the raw materials to build it, the EU is making itself more dependent on China, while at the same time losing its industrial champions to the strategic policies of the United States.
The core problem seems to be that these high-stakes, unconventional financial moves to solve a foreign policy crisis are happening at the exact same time as domestic policies are making Europe prohibitively expensive and uncompetitive.
The question isn't whether Europe is facing a challenge anymore. It's whether the current structure, the current set of policies can possibly succeed. They're taking radical legal risks abroad while their industrial base at home is being systematically hollowed out.
The confluence of legal instability, self-inflicted industrial damage, and strategic resource dependency suggests that the current structural challenges facing the European project are far more profound than any short-term stabilization measures can address.